Hi, in this video we're going to discuss key aspects of instruction that align with the science of reading as understood here in the state of Arkansas. There's a very specific approach to instruction that we're talking about when we're talking about something being aligned with the science of reading. Like we've been saying before, key things to remember: the simple view of reading informs science reading based approaches as we're understanding it in this discussion. Scarborough's reading rope. Pay very close attention to the strands in and the connective strands in Scarborough's reading rope, and pay very close attention to what is coming out of the International Dyslexia Association, IDA. They are having a very strong influence, a driving influence on movement in the science of reading as it's influencing the state of Arkansas. Now, if you're teaching in Missouri, perhaps, or planning on teaching in Missouri, or another state for that matter, I'm targeting this after Arkansas, and these discussion points in this video is targeted off of what I find produced by DESE here in Arkansas. But these strands and this approach to instruction is very, very consistent across the nation. And you see this movement taking place across the nation. So what I'm talking about here is going to be very consistent with what you'll find in Missouri or in other states that are moving in the science of reading direction. Here are some resources. If you take a look at the handout, you'll notice very clearly that I drew liberally from that handout. This handout produced by the state of Arkansas, DESE, is the basis for what I'm going to be talking about today. I also looked at the approved curriculum as well as training resources on RISE, Reading Initiative for Student Success. I strongly recommend that you consider going through RISE training. It's really going to help you prepare for job interviews and prepare for the type of instruction that the state really wants you to do. Even if you're not a specific reading teacher, it would help you. So, first of all, understand what phonological awareness is. If you're going to take tests, even if you're a middle and secondary teacher, you're going to want to know about these topics. Obviously, typically, phonological awareness, that's an early literacy area. Phonological awareness, phonemic awareness are typically addressed kindergarten through first grade, perhaps second grade. But at the same time, it's important for you to know about these things. Sometimes you might, on rare occasions, find a middle school student who's struggling in this area, but typically speaking, when we're talking about phonological and phonemic awareness, we're talking about early literacy areas. So phonological awareness is the ability to notice sound structure in spoken words. And I've provided you an example of structured literacy that deals with phonological awareness at the kindergarten level. Now, I want you to pay very close attention. Structured literacy approaches to education, such as what you'd find with Hegarty or with Orton Gillingham, for instance, trainings, that's being strongly favored by the state, by DESE, so you should be aware of that. So there are different stages that a child will go through as they develop phonological awareness skills. You develop an awareness of rhyming words. So you can identify words that rhyme. You develop an awareness of syllables, and you start to manipulate these syllables. Eventually, the child develops an awareness, and this is a linear path. Eventually, a child develops an awareness of onsets and rhymes, an onset being the initial phonological unit in a word, the b in bat, rhyme being the sounds that follow. The at in bat would be the rhyme. And you can manipulate, you can play with these things as you're teaching a child this. The link that I provided you gives you an example of how a kindergarten teacher does that. Then, again, linearly, the child develops the ability to uh, deal with sound isolation, deal with beginning, middle, and ending sounds in words. Then we get into phonemic blending. That's putting sounds together. You put the b, at, t together to get bat. Next, you get phonemic segmentation. That's pulling words apart. So you've got bat, but now you pull it apart. So you know how to blend and you know how to segment. And then you get into phoneme manipulation, omitting or substituting sounds to produce a new word. And phonemic awareness. We talk a lot about phonemic awareness. That's a fundamental aspect of what the National Reading Panel identified that we need to be addressing, is the ability to identify, isolate, and manipulate language at the individual sound level. And phonemic awareness is part of the overall umbrella of phonological awareness. And I give you an example of a lesson that deals with phonemic awareness here. And this is especially targeted for those of you that are going to teach early literacy. I realize that in this course, I have various students that are going to teach at various levels. Some of you are K through 2, some of you want to be grades 3 through 5, some of you want to be middle school, and a relatively smaller number of you want to be high school. You've got some basic phonological awareness skills that need to be developed. Um, Generally speaking, phonological awareness is mastered by the end of first grade, although that's not always the case. Some students that are struggling in reading might still be struggling with phonological awareness after the first grade. Phoneme blending that we were just talking about is generally mastered at the end of first grade, identified the ability to hear parts of words and syllables in isolation. And you've got phoneme segmentation, the ability to break words down into their individual sounds. You've got advanced phonological awareness skills. This includes deleting phonemes. So you identify how a word would sound if one of the sounds were omitted. So let's say baseball. What does it sound if you take away one of the sounds, right? Substituting phonemes, manipulating spoken words by substituting certain sounds for other sounds. Then you've got reversing phonemes, reversing the order of sounds in a word. And if the phonemes in the word bat are reversed, you get tab, for instance. That's an example of reversing phonemes. You can do lots of games and activities with children to help them learn this. And again, this builds toward phonics. Phonological awareness is a very common source of word-level reading difficulties. It's an essential aspect of skilled reading. It's also essential part of sight word learning. And again, we want to work toward automaticity with sight words. Listening comprehension, of course, comes before reading comprehension. And you remember with the simple view of reading, the formula, decoding times listening comprehension, and you get reading comprehension for the simple view of reading. DESE here in Arkansas strongly is urging and recommending the following implications. Early explicit and systematic instruction in phonics combined with early explicit and systematic instruction in phonological awareness in order to prevent and remediate reading difficulties. And trust me on this, the state is not playing around. They really want this. And one thing that research shows nationwide, not just in Arkansas, is that too many teachers, whether we're talking about beginning teachers fresh out of a teacher education program or veteran teachers in early literacy, don't really know how to engage in early explicit and systematic instruction at this area, and they don't really understand aspects of phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. And that's a problem. It is one reason why many students are struggling in these areas. This data is also recommending a combination of explicit phonics and phonological training for students in kindergarten and first grade. Next, we deal with phonics. Phonics focuses on the relationships between letters and sounds. Instruction moves from letter-sound correspondences eventually to graphemes, syllables, and morphemes. And I define for you here what a grapheme is and what a morpheme is. Orthographic mapping. That's something that too often, in my experience, is overlooked in instruction. And the science of reading alignment approach is very much urging us not to skip over orthographic mapping at the early literacy level. So orthographic mapping deals with the ability to quickly and efficiently add words to our sight vocabulary. We memorize these words and we're able to connect words that we've memorized to the same words when we encounter them again, or similar words, so that the words are instantly recognizable, leading toward automaticity in your reading. And I've provided you a link for um, for an activity that can help build automaticity with vocabulary in early literacy. Skilled readers can identify words with a high degree of accuracy, and they can sound them out. The state is again recommending very much early, explicit, and systematic instruction in phonics, combined with, of course, phonemic awareness, starting in the kindergarten and first grade. And very much, remember, we've been talking about the bottom-up versus top-down approaches to reading. This is very much a code-based approach to instruction that the state of Arkansas wants you to engage in. And that's true whether you're a reading teacher or whether you're a science teacher. They want us to be consistent on this. Next, we get into fluency. Fluency is the ability to read a text at an appropriate speed and pace, read it accurately, and read it with proper expression. Proper expression gets into another term called prosody. Prosody would be prosody. So fluency is basically appropriate speed. Oftentimes you'll see quick and fast. I don't want to see readers that just go and they don't understand what they read. The appropriateness of the speed is important, not just blind speed reading, but appropriate pace, appropriate speed, with accuracy and with appropriate proper expression. Joe Torgerson out of the state of Florida, and he's a major researcher in this field. We'll talk to you here about fluency in this link that I provided to you. I strongly recommend that. He's very influential in this, and he's a strong researcher. He's a legitimate strong researcher, and he's very influential in this area. Fluency is developed partly by sight vocabulary. Sight vocabulary strongly contributes to fluency. If a student is good at orthographic mapping, then automaticity in recognizing words, then reading practice is helpful to increase fluency. On the other hand, if a child doesn't have automaticity in recognizing words, then the reading practice might contribute to struggles because the child is going to be very frustrated. And so reading practice that's associated with frustration doesn't necessarily help increase fluency, and in fact, it might lead to an experience of I hate reading. Fluent readers can better devote their attention to comprehension. Here we get into, by the way, the fact that we have limited attention spans. This deals with basically the way the brain works. So if you are spending a great deal of your attention when you're reading on trying to figure out your sight vocabulary, trying to figure out phonics rules, trying to figure out segmenting and blending and blah blah blah, and if you don't have those aspects to the point where you have automaticity, then you're not going to have enough attention to even try, even really focus on comprehension, because your attention will be devoted to those things. The more automatic your word recognition and phonics comes, the more attention you have to devote to meaning making. Fluency is understood as a bridge between decoding and making meaning of the text in a useful way. As children become fluent readers, they gain the ability to increasingly address challenging texts. Next, vocabulary. And of course, at the middle school secondary level, typically you would focus a great deal of your content area reading and reading instruction on fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. But and especially at the middle school level, a lot of fluency at the high school level. If your children are not at the high school level fluent readers, then you would want to address fluency. If they are fluent readers, then there's no need for a great deal of fluency drills if they're already fluent readers. But a vocabulary and comprehension instruction are still very important for you to integrate into your subject area if you're at the high school level. Obviously, like we've said, sometimes struggling students will still struggle with decoding and phonics at middle school and high school. So vocabulary basically is not only understanding the word's basic definition, but how to understand that word in context in which it's used. Whether it's spoken, reading, some words have different meanings in different contexts. And again, you've got different types of vocabulary. You've got listening vocabulary, speaking vocabulary, reading vocabulary, and writing vocabulary. Typically speaking, our listening vocabulary is significantly greater than our speaking vocabulary, for instance. And so we might understand some words better in one or the other types of vocabulary. Typically speaking, especially as you're a young reader, or if you're reading a second language, you have an easier time picking up the listening before you pick up the speaking and the writing. Tiers of vocabulary. The concept of tiers, pioneered and researched by Isabel Beck, is very important for you to work with. You've got tier 1 words. These are basic, everyday, extremely common words like happy, sad. You don't really need to spend much time on tier 1 words, typically speaking, unless you're at the pretty early literacy level, or you're dealing with second language learners and you're focused on second language learning instruction. Tier 2 words, these are high frequency words that are used by mature readers in conversational language. This would be conversational vocabulary, words like sympathy, medicine, right? And so if you've got a learner who is struggling with basic conversational vocabulary, that can impede instruction. So yeah, if you want to deal with that, and if you can anticipate certain conversational vocabulary, high frequency vocabulary that might cause problems for students, you do want to teach that vocabulary directly. And next, you've got tier 3 words. For those of you that are teaching science or math or English language arts, you would want to spend a great deal of time and focus on your tier 3 words. These are low frequency words except in very specific particular contexts. We've got certain vocabulary words that are very specific to science, math, social science, English language arts. For instance, cosine and tangent, right, in math. Those have very specific academic vocabulary meaning for math. And in fact, the word tangent has a different meaning in mathematics than it might in conversational language, if we were to say that he went on a tangent, right? So you want to teach and put a great deal of focus on this tier 3 vocabulary before, during, and after the learning activities that children engage in. You've got a link here with Isabel Beck that I encourage you to look at. And you want to make sure that you are very explicitly helping children to build connections between vocabulary words and spelling patterns. Morphology will help not only with spelling patterns, but also with sight words and with understanding words in context. Not to mention, if you have a pretty strong understanding of Latin and Greek roots and so forth, but especially Latin and Greek roots, given the influence of Latin on the English language, then you can figure out difficult words. This helps you strategically figure out difficult words. So you can help your students learn how to segment words into prefixes, suffixes, roots, and base parts. Um, you can also help your students understand the etymology, the origin of words. Sometimes that can be difficult if you're dealing with second language learners because oftentimes a second language learner will very commonly ask you what's the origin, what's the etymology of a particular word, and it might be a word that you and I as native English speakers take for granted. And so we need to look that up because it's a serious question, because oftentimes, especially in languages other than English, the origin of a word has a particular story behind it and that can help in the mind of the second language learner, help them understand that word in greater depth. So awareness of morphology has a very positive influence on reading comprehension. The state is strongly recommended, and I would agree, of course, that there's a strong relationship between vocabulary and reading comprehension. The research strongly supports this. Reading aloud to children builds a foundation for vocabulary development and literacy development. So yeah, the state definitely recommends targeted activities where you read aloud to children. And you can, along with that read aloud, you can scaffold instruction, you can do think aloud, you can directly talk about vocabulary that has come across, you can help students understand how you figured out difficult words. So you can do very targeted instruction along with the reading aloud. Again, the state recommends very systematic and explicit instruction, and they have a very specific way that they are defining success-oriented as well as engaging. To be systematic, defined by the state, is that you are following a specific scope and sequence of your instruction of each individual skill that you're teaching. If you're teaching, for instance, fluency, if you're doing a fluency exercise, then you've got a very clear outline based upon a curriculum that focuses on the materials that you're using, the plans that you're making for how students will develop their particular level of fluency toward a higher level of fluency. And your instruction is very clear and it is very precise with the students. A little bit more on what we mean by scope and sequence. Scope refers to the areas of development addressed by the curriculum. For instance, if you're teaching phonemic awareness, then it would be what stage of phonological awareness or phonemic awareness are you focusing on? If you're focusing on fluency, then what exact aspect of fluency are you focusing on? Are you focusing on prosody? Are you focusing on understanding of sight words? Are you focusing on appropriate pace? Are you pace and tone? What exactly are you focusing on? If you're focusing on vocabulary within your content area, which is pretty common for content area reading, then what is the very specific systematic way in which you are helping students understand certain tier 3 words? The experiences build progressively from less complex to more complex. skill development and concept understanding. The goal is supported as they uh, move in progression of their development of skills. And I've given you a video about how to follow a curriculum map and a scope and sequence recommended by a district. Sequences of learning experiences should include multiple related opportunities for children to explore a concept such as a vocabulary word as well as skill, recognizing that vocabulary word, blending, using roots, prefixes, that sort of thing, with increasing depth. The sequences of learning experiences should be adaptive based upon the assessment of learning gains or difficulties that the students are having. This is assessment-driven instruction, and you should be continuously able to adapt your instruction based upon assessment of learning gains or struggles. And right here, this is what the state means by engaged and success-oriented instruction. The state has a very definitive definition of this, and you need to target your instruction accordingly. By engagement, the state means active participation in instructional activities. So they want to see, they don't want to see children sleeping, they don't want to see children drifting around, not knowing quite what to do. They want the children in very targeted, specific, active participation in a goal-oriented instructional activity. You want to minimize the errors made in reading as they're or in other areas such as science, math, and so forth. And when you do see errors being made, you want to give immediate corrective feedback and supportive feedback to that student in ways that are very specific and targeted to address errors for that student. Okay, so hopefully this helped you. And I do recommend keeping this PowerPoint and referring back to it. This is very much going to help you as you become a beginning teacher and as you prepare for your job interviews. Take care.